So thank you, everyone, and especially our colleagues at Terillium, and all you participants that have given us the opportunity to present to you here today. I'll go ahead and talk a little more about the Canon solution for AP automation with JD Edwards, especially leveraging the Cafe One capabilities. So if I could, I'd just like to step through this little process flow diagram here with you. This serves as a really good reference for an automated AP process like you're about to see. I'll just point out a few things before I step through it. If you look at the bottommost swim lanes here, the ones with the light blue shading in the background, those all represent automated steps or modules within the Canon solution. Everything that you're going to see here is produced by Canon. I should point out there are two families of modules, though, Iris Extract and Enterprise Imaging Platform. All tightly integrated like it's one solution. You'd never know that it wasn't one solution. But if I could just step through the normal process here, as far as things that tend to stay the same or tend to be manual, it's no great surprise that suppliers are still sending buying organizations invoices, like you see at the very top left. That's where the process starts. Of course, a solution like this can handle other types of input channels, things like electronic invoicing networks and EDI and those sorts of things. But still more commonly for first-time demos, we focus on the traditional means of providing supplier invoices, which are paper documents that are shipped via a postal service, or maybe increasingly common, or invoices that are attached to emails and sent to a designated account at a buying org. So in both of those cases, like you see here, for paper documents, the process starts where those will be scanned, either through an MFP device or on a dedicated scanner. If they are scanned on a dedicated scanner, we have a module called Power Scan that you'll see shortly that is really, really useful for that purpose, for scanning paper documents. It's all integrated in with Iris Extract. It's part of Iris Extract, actually. For invoices that are emailed from suppliers, we have a component called XMail Fetcher that runs on a server and automatically intercepts those invoices and processes them just as if they had been scanned. So there's no need to print PDF images of invoices and rescan them and things like that. We see a lot of those things in manual environments when invoices are emailed in. But at any rate, once invoices are either scanned or mailed in, there are two modules that you'll see here, import and analyze. These run really seamlessly to the user, I should say, maybe transparently to the user. The user doesn't interact really with these modules. They run on a server as a background process. Import its function is kind of self-evident. It ingests the invoices that comes through and presents them to analyze. Analyze is really where the main work of this Iris Extract technology takes place, because that's where the invoice data is actually read from the document, regardless of how many pages or how many line items on an invoice or anything like that, or how the invoice is structured. Analyze will read that invoice data off of it. There's also performing validation here as well, and you'll see this in the demo. Not just validating, of course, country-specific date formats and currencies and separators for decimals and for thousands. Of course, it validates those and the rules that you've got in place for how data should be captured per se, as far as the actual characters. But it also performs validation against JD Edwards early in the process here, because it's usually a lot less expensive and costly to resolve discrepancies or handle exceptions very early in the process. And we give you that opportunity to do that at this early stage here. So when it's required, invoices that have run through the system can be verified. And I show the verified module here, and I show, if you will, an accounts payable clerk up here. It's usually an accounts payable person that does this invoice verification. They'll receive a notification, of course. Their main job at this stage of the process, though, is simply to check the invoice image and check the data that was captured from it pretty quickly, actually, and just to spot check it and make sure that it looks fine before confirming that the invoice should be processed through the solution. In many cases, invoices, as time goes on, as the system learns about your supplier's invoices, the verification step is not necessary. When invoices analyze in a complete status, you have the option of turning verification off, so that for that supplier anyway, so you won't have to verify that supplier's invoices and they can process straight on through. But I'll show you what verification looks like. It's a good way to demonstrate the system. In some cases, customers may decide to match to the purchase order at this stage in the process. In some cases, they might even decide to provide the geocoding if it's available at this stage in the process, if the AP person either knows how to code the invoice or if there's some supporting documentation with it that lets them know how to. But at any rate, once the invoice has been verified, if it's required, the data and the image pass through then to EIP. This is EIP modules here. It's completely a web-based interface running on Oracle Fusion middleware with the Web Center content services. So everything really is very Oracle-centric in terms of the technology, validated by Oracle, like we said as well. But at any rate, if it's a non-PO invoice, like you see here, more than likely, if it hasn't been coded earlier in the process, it'll be routed automatically to a business user, which I show as a requester here. The business user will normally know how to code that invoice, which project or which department or organization it applies to. Once they've performed that step, it could be that they have approval authority as well, and it's all coded and approved in one step. More than likely, in most cases, it's coded by one person and it'll climb to one or more other people for it to be approved according to an approval hierarchy. So that's the approval step that I show here. And once that's done, the voucher is automatically created in JD Edwards by our solution. And of course, the approval could be multi-level here. I just show one step here, but it could be that an invoice, depending on the monetary amount, has to go to a manager, then a director, then a VP, for example. All those multi-levels of approvals are supported by the system as well. A PO invoice typically follows a slightly different path. If it's been matched earlier in the process, like in the verification step, normally it'll flow straight on through and create the voucher, even though I'm not showing it here so much. But if you need someone to confirm the matching that's been done, or the matching needs to be completed, it can be routed and the matching can be done in EIP as well. Normally, again, an invoice that's been matched to a purchase order won't require approval. In some cases, we see two-way invoices for services and things like that may in some cases require one little optional approval step, and that's completely supported by the solution as well. Like I mentioned, once the invoice has been approved or matched, the voucher is automatically created in JD Edwards. That's where the payback really comes from, this analyze step. With all that data, all those line items from those tables on the invoice document were captured, you save that effort for entering all of that information when you create the voucher. It's really, it's a labor-saving device, as well as it helps to increase accuracy. So when we create that voucher, we attach links to the content. I'm showing attached content here. We actually don't attach the content to JD Edwards or to the JD Edwards database. We don't want to burden your JD Edwards database with a lot of documents and images and those sorts of things. So we actually store that on Enterprise Imaging Platform as a repository, where everything related to the invoice, all the content, the images, the supporting documentation, the workflow history, the collaboration notes, all of that is actually stored in an EIP repository, and we just build links to it. And that's where the Cafe One functionality really comes in, because it's a very rich interface for retrieving that data into JD Edwards using Cafe One. But from that point on, honestly, once the invoice is created and been processed through our solution and it's sitting in JD Edwards, the process from that point on is mostly standard JD Edwards in terms of interfacing with general ledger and posting and scheduling payments and that sort of thing. So if I could, I'll just jump into a quick demo here. So if you notice here, I mentioned that I would show the power scan module, and that's exactly what you're seeing here over towards the top left portion of the screen. Power scan, and I'll create a batch is what it's called. When I create a batch, it's basically feeding an invoice from a paper invoice from my scanner directly in at this moment. If you notice, it's actually feeding in invoices. I haven't committed anything yet. They're just being fed in to be committed, or to be corrected and then committed, if you will. So if you notice here, I just scanned in 2 invoices were fed through. Each one looks like it's a single page invoice. It could be multiple pages as well, but just to keep it simple, just showing a single page invoice. As you notice through PowerScan, I've got some options here. I could actually insert additional pages if I needed to just rescan one page. I could do that, like you see here. I could mark pages as attachments or split an invoice up into into multiple invoices if I needed to, if I scanned a batch. I can do a lot of different things like that that make PowerScan, excuse me, very, very, very useful. So what I'll do here, though, just in case of simplicity, I'll just process this batch, which means I'm committing it. I'm actually feeding the documents into the Iris Extract solution right now. That import process I spoke about earlier is taking effect now. So import and analyze, like I said, the users don't really interact with it. It just ran here, and it's bringing in these invoices that we just scanned. And this is the verification step. It's called the verify module. This is a Windows client that you're seeing here, but it's also available as a web user interface. If you notice here, what I've done is just zoned in on the top left-hand portion of the document, which gives us a chance to talk a little bit about automatic vendor identification. If you notice here, what's happening is that the vendor's already been identified. I didn't do anything to this invoice as far as touching it. To just understand how verify works, you'll see the image of the invoice here in the middle section of the screen. Any pages that would be, if there are multiple pages, you see those in this leftmost window. But over towards the right here, you'll see the data that was either captured directly off the invoice document or used to look up data that's being displayed, like from JD Edwards, for example. So with automatic vendor identification, if you notice, it's actually pulled in the vendor number from JD Edwards, number 4319. That's the vendor ID in the address book for this vendor, and it's actually using the street address information that's on the invoice document that you see here in the yellow shading from the invoice document. It's comparing that to what's in JD Edwards, which you see here in the blue shaded fields. These aren't actually populated from the document. They're being retrieved from JD Edwards. It's actually comparing that to this to find a match, and that's how it's returning the vendor number. That's how it knows which vendor this invoice belongs to. In this case, it's just using street address information, but it's really not limited. It can use any information associated with the supplier in JD Edwards, and that includes things like the bank account information, any types of contacts or email addresses or phone numbers that are associated with the supplier as well. So you might wonder what would happen if the vendor wasn't automatically identified. That's certainly possible. It's actually pretty rare, but it's certainly possible. What I'll do here is I just press the hotkey while my focus was in that vendor number field. And down below, you notice I've actually got a search grid. I press the hotkey here to bring up a search grid that lists all of the vendors that are in JD Edwards. And this is completely filterable, completely sortable, all the values that you see down here. And we can actually display additional attributes from the vendor information in JD Edwards to help you make that decision. So really the main purpose here of displaying this list down below is to make a correction if I decided that this invoice actually did not belong to this vendor. So if I wanted to do that, I can filter down below, I can sort, I can scroll through it. And all I did here was just allow it to use the same vendor that was already on the document rather than changing it and making things a little more complicated for the demo. So if you notice here, then I'll sort of focus a little more on the fields that I'll call straight capture. The invoice date, for example, you see where it's captured from. And whenever I toggle to a field here that's been captured, you'll see that it toggles the yellow shading in the document to show me where that was captured from, like the invoice date, like the due date, the tax amount that's on the invoice, the total amount, whether it be gross or net on the invoice itself. And the fields are actually captured based on the titles that are associated with them. For example, if I toggle there in the invoice number field, you'll see where it's captured from, and that's a standard title that the product comes preceded with to automatically capture without you doing anything. So I don't have to do this, but if you're wondering how it would look if it couldn't capture an invoice number, maybe the title of vendor printed was something we completely didn't expect, like maybe a request number. We've actually seen that. So if you notice what I've done here, I've blanked out the invoice number as if it hadn't been captured. To capture a value like that, if it was an unusual title, it's simply a question of clicking on the document, which I just did. As soon as I clicked on that field there, it populated the invoice number. And this is where the real benefit comes in, because at this point, if I press a hotkey, certain hotkey, it will actually train the system to recognize the invoice number to be captured from this label here, regardless of what this label is. This label could be my name, for example. And then in the future, for this supplier, it'll automatically capture the invoice number if the label, for example, would be my name. So I think that's something that really kind of sets us apart in terms of the intelligence of our solution. Of course, a comment is possible. Very common for AP clerks to send comments or instructions to people involved with processing invoices through the solution. So if you notice there, I'm actually entering a comment in that field. You'll see how that follows through in workflow. And I'm sending this out to this user, Pat Stock, that I'm seeing here, Mrs. Pat Stock. Her ID is actually operations. I'm sending it out to her to check the coding or to provide coding on this invoice since it's a non-PO invoice. She's actually going to provide the coding. The coding in this case will be done by someone in the field, which is actually more common really than an AP person doing it, at least in my experience. So I'll go ahead and commit that invoice, and it's going to flow out of Iris like I showed on the diagram. And what I'll do is I'll just switch over here to EIP. So this is where business users really interact with the system. They'll typically receive an email that tells them that there's an invoice they have to work on. They can also log into their console, if you will, which is what I've just done as that user operations that I set this invoice to. I logged into her user interface like you see here. And if you notice, if she chooses her queue, like I just did from that little envelope, it shows all the invoices that are waiting her attention. So these are all the invoices that are waiting her attention. And there at the very top, you'll see the invoice, the non-PO invoice we just now processed through in Verify. So if I were to edit that invoice, I'm being asked to review the coding or to provide the coding. You see, as I toggle down to the GL distribution section, it has not been coded yet. If I were to have aliases or shortcuts to codes that are commonly used or codes that default to the supplier, you would see those populated here. In this case, I'll just provide what I'll call fresh accounting. I'll just code it to whatever I want to in JD Edwards. And as I do that, if you notice, as I type in the chart of accounts value in that GL account field, it's actually constraining it or limiting it to just those values that are supported by this JD Edwards installation here that's set up. So go ahead and edit that GL account value. Save that field. Update it. Now submit the invoice. Once I do so, you're going to see that the approval policy has been started. If you notice that comment there at the very top right hand, it looks different from pending code review. And what I'm doing here is it's actually going to climb to a different person to approve, a person named Casey Brown. So as I refresh that screen, you're going to see that assignee column changes there. It's going to change shortly to Casey Brown. I'll just log in and log out, I should say, and then log in as Casey Brown to see how that invoice flows through to the next step in the approval process. I'm logging in here as Casey Brown. And again, Casey will show all the invoices in her queue that need her attention. There's the invoice here. Pending management approval is now the status. It's in Casey's queue. You can drill down into the invoice details like you see here. And then from here, you scroll over and see the workflow log, the actual audit trail. You see, if you remember, I actually entered a comment when I was an AP clerk to please attach a directive statement, which is just some supporting documentation. And there's the time and date stamps for all the important actions that have happened on the invoice. You see the GL accounting there as well below. I did mention an approval policy. This invoice, it would have only required, it would have been able to have been approved by Pat Stock had it been for less than $100. This is actually what the approval rules look like. Since it's for greater than $100, it's going to climb to a manager in the same division as that user, Pat Stock. And in this case, it happens to be Casey Brown, who has that management role. That's why it routed to her for approval here. And again, the instruction there was to attach some supporting documentation called a directive statement. So I'll do that here. that file here. And I do want to remember to let you know too that additional comments can be entered here. It's a good idea to let them know that you have attached it, for example. These are preserved for however long you want them to be according to your retention policies. So that's been attached there. Got a good audit trail with this invoice. There's the accounting information. And of course, you can also view the image from here as well. If I simply click that link there, you'll see that I can view the invoice image. You might remember that when we saw it back in the workflow. I mean, in the ARIS extract verify. I'll approve this invoice. If you notice, I just simply choose that drop down there. And the option of entering one additional comment at the very end. And now that invoice has been approved. And it creates this voucher in real time. It's very quick too. If you notice there, status is now JD Edwards voucher created at the very top right there. And it returns back a voucher ID. If I press that link to that voucher ID, it navigates me straight into JD Edwards. And from there, I can navigate directly into that voucher. From here, you'll see all the content, like I mentioned, that's related to this invoice, that's attached to the CafeOne panel, if you will, to the right there. And then we can retrieve the invoice image, for example. That's the invoice image, you might remember. And there was a directive statement attached as well. We can actually retrieve that from here too. That's needed. And one other thing too that's quite useful is that with CafeOne and this type of integration, you can actually drag and drop content directly to that window, and it'll attach it automatically. If you notice there, I just took a JPEG file from my desktop and I dragged it, and now it's been attached automatically to the invoice in JD Edwards. So that's something that users really have. The feedback we've gotten is that is very, very, very useful and something that they really, really do like. And again, comments can still be attached even after the voucher is created. You can attach more comments to have a more complete audit trail for this invoice. So that's it really for what I wanted to show you with the demo. I do thank you for the opportunity to present to you today. And I'll just pass it back to my colleagues at Terillium for some final comments.